Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today I am here with a 5-card, 1-kit video for the Simon Says Stamp Beautiful Butterflies card kit, which I believe is the May 2020. And like I said, we're going to be creating 5 very simple cards, and I tried my best not to bring in too many outside supplies outside of what comes in the kit. So let's get started on card number 1. So I'm going to be using some of the butterflies from the stamp set here, and I'm bringing out my mini Misty because I know I'm going to have to stamp these a few times, and I'm going to stamp them later on too. So I'm going to leave my stamps in place once I have them laid out. I'm going to use a total of 4 of the butterflies, and this is a piece of Canson watercolor paper. So it is textured, so you don't always get the best impression the first time around, and this is the first time I'm stamping any of these images. So 2 strikes against me, so I'm definitely using my Misty for this one. So the first time around, I went ahead and stamped this out with some blackout ink by Ink on 3. This is a Copic Safe ink, but it is also a waterproof ink. So you can use it for watercoloring and Copics, which we are going to be doing both on this card. So I stamped these a total of 3 times to make sure that I have a bold black outline, and because it's going to fade away a little bit. And you'll see why in a minute. But once I have this stamped out, I'm going to be using 3 different colors of Distress Oxides. I'm bringing in Fossilized Amber, Wild Honey, and Carved Pumpkin. And I'm just using a large acrylic block just to kind of smush some of that ink on there. We're going to be doing a very messy watercolor background, but I don't want my colors to be too far off. I want them to kind of match and mesh well together. So I figured I'd pick these 3 because they do go well together. So I have some water and a paintbrush, and I'm going to start by taking some clean water and just kind of adding that to my butterflies and all around my butterflies just to get my paper wet. And then I'm going to start dropping in the color. I'm going to start with one of the lighter colors and kind of just drop that in and let it spread on its own. Then I'll go in with the next color and do the same thing, just let them mesh together and blend together, and then finish off with the Carved Pumpkin, which is the darkest and the brightest out of the 3, and just let that mix in with the 2 yellowish tones. I also added some spatters to the background, and the spatters are going to blend in with the background, but they'll still be a little bit noticeable as long as your panel is still wet. If you want the spatters to remain spatters, wait till your panel dries and then add them, but I didn't want them to be, I just wanted them to be part of the background, if that makes any sense. So once that's done, I went ahead and let my panel dry for about a half an hour or so. You can use a heat gun to speed up the process, but I prefer just to let mine air dry. I get less warping that way. Once that is dry, I am going to add some color to these butterflies. Obviously, they already have color from the background, but I want these to really stand out. So I'm only using 2 different Copics here. I'm using a YR68 and a Y17, I believe. And I'm just adding a little bit of the darker color there, the YR68, to just some random areas on the butterfly. I'm not really too concerned where I put them, just as long as the butterflies really pop off the page. And just by adding a little bit of extra color to them, even though these colors match the background colors, they'll really pop from the background, if that makes any sense. Hopefully that makes sense. And you can use as many colors as you want here. I just decided to use the 2. So I went ahead and did that with all 4 of the butterflies. Like I said, just random areas. I didn't keep all the coloring in because it's pretty repetitive. So once that is done, I want to make my images stand out even more. Now, because the Distress Oxides are more opaque than most inks, my black outline on my butterflies is toned down quite a bit, and I want them to stand out again. Now, you can just stamp it with the regular ink that you use to stamp your images initially, but I really wanted them to pop. So I'm going to do some heat embossing. Like I said, I left the 4 images that I stamped with in my Misty. So they are already lined up exactly the way they need to be. So I'm just going to pop my panel right back in my Misty the way I had it before. I'm going to treat this with my anti-static tool, especially if your ink is not 100% dry. Mine is, but just in case, make sure you use your anti-static tool. Then I'm going to stamp these out with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is it's a fast drying pigment ink. So you want to work a little bit quicker than you would with most pigment inks, but it will stay wet long enough to do your heat embossing. I sprinkled on some clear embossing powder, and this is the detailed embossing powder because obviously these images are pretty detailed, and let my heat gun heat up for about 30 seconds or so before bringing that to the paper and heat setting all of my images. Now, you do want to make sure your heat gun is heated up for a few seconds or so before bringing it to your paper, and this will minimize the amount of warping you have. Being I used so much water and then heat on top of it, I did have some warping, but I'm using fun foam to adhere this to my card panel, so it really wasn't too big of a deal. Went ahead and wiped off that panel to get all that dust off from my anti-static tool, and then I'm going to trim this down a little bit. Well, first I added some shimmer with a Spectrum Noir shimmer pen, and then I will add my sentiment. And I couldn't decide which sentiment I wanted to use from the stamp set, so I ended up using two, one for the front and one for the inside of the card. Just using my acrylic block for this one, and I am going to stamp this larger sentiment with the same VersaFine Onyx Black ink that I used on the butterflies. Again, treating that area with my anti-static tool, stamping that with the VersaFine ink, sprinkling on the clear embossing powder and heat setting that. My heat gun is already pretty much heated up from before, but like I said, just to minimize that warping, you do want to make sure that it is nice and hot. Now for the inside of the card, I am going to use the other sentiment that I wanted to use, and also the smaller butterfly, just to decorate the inside a little bit. Now remember, this is fast drying pigment ink, but it doesn't dry immediately, so you want to make sure that you put your card base aside for a couple of minutes to dry and leave it open so it doesn't smear. Finally, I am going to pop this panel up with some fun foam that I have cut just a little bit smaller than the panel itself. And I'm using some score tape on the opposite side. I have the fun foam that has adhesive on one side, so I'm using some score tape on the opposite side to pop this up onto my panel, and this will just give a nice white border on all four sides. Finished off with a few Cloud 9 Nouveau Dream Drops, just kind of around everywhere. And that is it for card number 1. For card number 2, it is going to be super, super simple, and this is great for a very quick card. I am going to use some of the pattern paper, and I love this floral arrangement here, but obviously I can't just glue this onto a card panel. I probably could, but I'm going to step it up just a little bit. So I went ahead and fussy cut this image out, and I'm just leaving a little bit of a border. Not that it matters, you can cut right up against the line if you prefer. You can see that I'm leaving my scissors pretty much straight with my right hand, which is my dominant hand, and turning the paper as I go with my less dominant hand, my left hand, and I trim off any excess that kind of gets in my way as I'm doing my fussy cutting, and that makes it a little bit easier as well. I'm not too concerned with the lower left-hand corner because that's going to be cut off anyway. I just want the basic shape of the image itself, and then we'll glue this down onto another piece of the pattern paper. So I put this aside for a minute and kind of went through the paper pack that comes in the kit, and these are bigger than a 6x6. I think they're 6x8. So it makes it much easier to use the same papers multiple times. So I picked out one that goes really well with the floral arrangement, and I cut this down to an A2 size card. We're going to use a die cut in the end, but I wasn't sure at this point, so I just cut it down to 5.5 by 4.25, and then glued my image down onto the left-hand corner. You can see that some of it is hanging off. That's perfectly fine. I planned on that anyway because I wasn't going to fussy cut all of those little leaves out. And once the glue has a couple of seconds to dry, and I probably gave it like a minute or so, I'm going to use this stitched rectangle die. This is also by Simon Says Stamp. And I'm just going to use a couple pieces of Post-it note tape to tape this down in place while I run it through my die cutting machine. That way it won't shift around as it goes through. Now I'm using a Gemini. I only had to run this through twice, even though it is 2 layers of cardstock. Depending on your die cutting machine, you may have to run it through twice just to make sure that it cuts through both layers. So once that's done, I went ahead and used one of the sentiments from the stamp set from the kit. I'm going to bring out my very favorite Simon Says Stamp die ink, the Hollyhock ink, and this matches that one flower really well. And I just stamped that off to the right hand side and glued this onto a white card base. I have a little bit of a border on the edges, but this is super simple, guys. This took me like 5 minutes. And I did finish off with a few Nuvo Dream Drops, once again, because they're sitting right there and I used them for the previous card, so why not? So that is it for card number 2. For the third card, I'm going to be using the stencil that comes in the kit, and I'm going to line this up onto a piece of Nina Solar White, and I want to block off this one butterfly that's kind of hanging off the side, just because I don't want to have a butterfly there. So I'm just using some Post-it note tape to mask that off, and then I'm going to flip that around and use some more Post-it note tape just so that my stencil doesn't shift as I do my ink blending. I'm going to use some Simon Says Stamp die inks for my ink blending, and I'm using these because they are not reactive with water. I'm going to be adding some moisture on top of it, and I don't want my colors to bleed. So I'm using the Doll Pink, and I'm using a blending buddy brush here by Trinity Stamps to do some ink blending just where my butterflies are. Once I have a good layer of that Doll Pink, I'm going to move on to that Hollyhock ink and blend that out a little bit further. Then the Hot Mama ink, and then the Wisteria ink. And I ended up adding a little bit more of that purple to the bottom just so that I have a little bit more of an even blend, I don't know, even coverage, I guess you could say. So an even amount of all of the different colors. You can use any colors here. I just wanted it to be bright and cheery. Now, once all of my ink blending was done, you really don't have to wait too long for this to dry because it's not like a distress ink or a distress oxide ink. So it doesn't take too long to dry, but you will want to make sure that you keep your stencil in place, but kind of get that excess ink that's sitting on top of it off before moving on to the next step, or else you're just going to smear that everywhere. So I just used a paper towel just to kind of clean that area up a little bit. I'm going to be using the Glitz Glitter Gel that is part of the kit as well. And from what I can tell, this is very similar to the Glimmer Paste by Nuvo, or by Tonic. Well, I guess it's Nuvo and Tonic. And I'm just going to use a palette knife here to spread that out onto my butterflies and all of these little dots. I did work in small areas at a time because this is a little bit thicker. The glitter itself is a little bit chunkier, and I wanted to get as much of a smooth blend as I could possibly get. You want to make sure that you remove your stencil and clean that off immediately, as well as your palette knife, because once it dries, it's stuck. Went ahead and put this aside to dry for a couple of hours. And while we're waiting for that to dry, let me talk a little bit about this giveaway. So I had purchased this bracelet for myself a while back, and it's a little charm bracelet that is for stampers and card makers. It has a little stamp, it's got an envelope, it has the little create on there. I love this bracelet. But I actually bought a second one too, and this was going to be one of the giveaways for the Caring Card Makers event that has been postponed. So I figured why not give it to one of you guys. I purchased this off of Etsy from another crafter, and I will link all of her information below in case you want to check out her shop. But all you have to do is leave a comment on this video by July 1st, and on July 3rd, I will announce the winner. You'll have 1 week to claim the prize. So back to the card. I let this dry, like I said, for a little bit, and I am going to trim this down. So I'm trimming a little bit off the sides and a little bit off the bottom, just so that it's a little tad bit smaller than an A2 size card. Also taking a piece of the pattern paper and cutting this down to 5.5 by 4.25 so that I have just a little bit of a border. Using my Tombow Mono Multi Glue to adhere my main panel down to this pattern paper. And you can see you can't really see too much of the pattern, but it really brings out the colors of the butterflies. Now for the sentiment, I'm going to be using this Thinking of You, and I want this to match my butterflies. So I'm using all 4 inks. You can see that I'm just going to use the very tip or the corner of the ink pad, and I'm using all 4 colors and kind of just letting them blend. You will not contaminate your ink pad by doing this. They are so similar that it's really not going to make a difference. You can see that I have all 4 colors in that sentiment, and I'm just going to use the lines that are part of the sentiment. I guess it's like a little box around it to make sure that I have an even border around the entire thing. Last, going to take some foam tape to adhere that or pop that up onto my card panel, and that is it. Nice and simple for this one as well. For the 4th card, I'm going to bring back out some of those butterfly stamps, and again bringing out my mini Misty here, and I'm just lining these up on top of one another, because this is going to be a strip onto my card panel. So again, going to stamp this out with the Blackout ink by Ink on 3. I did stamp these twice just to have a bold black outline. And I'm going to be doing some very, very simple Copic coloring. Once again, I'm not going to show you all of the coloring because it does become a little repetitive. I use the same 2 color combinations for all 3 of the butterflies, but I will show you one just to get an idea of how I did my shading. So I'm going to start off with the R89. No, I didn't. I started with the R59, and I'm just going to add a little bit of that to the darkest areas. Now, normally I would start off with my lightest color to get the paper saturated so that my colors blend a little bit easier. But being I'm using such dark colors, I don't want them to bleed. So I don't want to oversaturate my paper, and I still was able to get a decent blend. So I blended this area out with the R85, then the R83, and finished off with the R81. You just want to make sure that when you go in with your lightest color, you're not going over the darkest area. Remember that the lighter the color, the more it's going to act as a colorless blender. You don't necessarily want to move the color around. You just want it to blend. I added this to a couple more areas on here just because I felt like it just wasn't enough. And then I will going to bring out another combination, and this is the, what was it? It was a R08, an R05, and an R02, so it's only a 3 color combo for this one. And I'm just going to do the same thing for the rest of the areas of this butterfly. I'm just going to pick a random area to have it be the darkest. It doesn't really matter where you put your shadows for a butterfly because all the butterflies are different. So there's really not a shadow area. You can kind of just put that darkest area wherever. But again, I did start off with that darkest color just to kind of minimize the amount of bleeding or prevent bleeding from happening, I should say, especially reds. They're very, very difficult to get rid of with the colorless blender, even with a gel pen sometimes. So I'm just going to finish off with that R02. And like I said, I did color in the rest of the butterflies pretty much the same way, just adding my shadows and highlights wherever I want, but use the same color combinations. Once my coloring was done, I went ahead and cut this into a strip, and being I didn't stamp these evenly, it was a little bit difficult to actually get the correct measurements, but I had to kind of shift it around in my tonic trimmer quite a few times to get this right. But once I did finally get it right, I also cut down a piece of black cardstock that is just a little bit wider than the strip itself. This way it'll really pop off my card base, and it will just add a little bit of a border to it. So I adhered the butterfly panel down to the black cardstock, and no, I didn't. I adhered the black cardstock to the card base and then the butterflies to the black cardstock. And again, I had a hard time lining this up too because it was a little bit wonky to begin with. So I ended up trimming this down a little bit so that you didn't see the edges being wonky. But before I did that, I went ahead and stamped out my sentiment, brought back out my Misty just because one of the sentiments is a solid sentiment. So I stamped this with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink once again. Didn't have to stamp it twice. I got a pretty good impression the first time. Added some shimmer to my butterflies, adhered this to a white card base, and that is it for this one. So for the fifth and final card, I think this was the most simple. And these were all simple, but this was the most simple. I have a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock here, and I'm going to use this solid circle sentiment, but I want them to be evenly spaced. So I took my T-square ruler and measured the stamp. It's a little bit smaller than 1.5 inches. So I'm going to create kind of like a grid lines onto my card panel. This is going to be cut down later, but it's just easier because I have them pre-cut. So I'm just using the entire panel at this point. And I'm measuring 1.5 inches. So this is just a little bit larger than the stamp itself. And I'm going to be using some rainbow colors and repeat stamping this same image. I am going to start off with the Hollyhock ink because it's my favorite. I did stamp this onto a scrap piece of paper first because I've never used this stamp, and it is a solid stamp, and I want to make sure that I get a really good impression. I love the Simon Says Stamp Die inks. I get a lot of questions. There's so many different colored inks on the market. I've had my Simon Says Stamp inks for many, many, many years. I've never had to replace any of them. They give me a great impression each and every time. So I just don't feel the need to purchase anything else. I do have some Hero Arts too, which is very similar to the Simon Says Stamp. But if I'm happy with what I have, I don't feel the need to purchase anything else. I do have quite a few different inks, but they all serve a different purpose. But just for a regular old colored ink, I find that the Simon Says Stamp is very, very good. They look a little blotchy in the beginning, but as it settles down into the paper, you'll see how it evens it out. And you can see that you can still see the word. You can still see the sentiment, which a lot of these type of stamps, you kind of lose the sentiment because the ink spreads. This doesn't. It stays put. It stays where it needs to stay. So I'm just finishing off with Audrey Blue, and I'll link all of the colors that I used in the description box below. And I went ahead and cut this down, and I'm just using those pencil lines as a guide as far as where I need to cut this. And this is just going to be popped up in the center of my card panel. Now, if you guys watched my channel before, or if you've even noticed what I did with the other cards in this video, I like to have a black mat on pretty much everything because I really feel like it makes it pop. And this card is so simple that I really need this to pop off the panel, or off the card base, I should say. So I measured this on my grid mat here and cut a piece of black cardstock that is just a little bit larger than this panel. It doesn't have to be a huge mat, just a little bit of that black cardstock showing will really make it pop. Again, I used some fun foam to pop this up onto my card base, and I used the score tape on one side and the adhesive that's already on the fun foam for the actual panel itself. And I kept looking at it and it was just way too simple, but there was really nothing else that I could do to the card. So I just added a little bit of shimmer with that same Spectrum Noir shimmer pen to all 4 or all 6 of the circles, and that is it. That's it for card number 5. Here's a quick look at all 5 cards that we created today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below, as well as more information about the giveaway. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day.